Now resume.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Today we will be dealing with the Fraser River Sockeye Spawning Initiative, also known as FRSSI, in these proceedings. My plan is to begin the day with Mr. Al Cass, who you've met before in this hearing, and then have him cover the background for the development of the model, and then have him be joined with by a few other people. We're going to have him joined by Rob Morley, Mike Staley, and Ken Wilson. And then I'll complete my direct evidence with that panel in the stand, and then once I've completed that, we'll open it for cross-examination. So that's the plan for today. I guess we can just reconfirm his oath.
Mr. Cass, you've been in before, so your oath is still in effect.
And I understand that when Mr. Cass was here before, his CV was not marked, so we should probably just do that for consistency. So his CV is in tab 7 of the binder before you, Mr. Cass, if that's helpful, and it's CAN 185914. This is your CV that you've provided to us. Is that right?
Correct.
Can you turn your mic on? Thank you. And
yes, that's correct.
Thank you. And you do need to speak quite close to the mic. So. All right. And just to recap, you have a Master's of Science in Environment and Management from Railroads University.
That's correct.
And you have been a research scientist a research biologist with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans from 77 to you're still considered to be a research biologist, but you certainly had...
Seems like a long time ago, but that's correct.
Had that title from 77 to 85, and since 85 to 82, you were the head of assessment and forecasting within the stock assessment at the department?
That's correct, yes.
And 2002 to 2010, you've been the head of the Center for Science Advice Pacific and the chair of the Pacific Science Advice Review Committee at Department of Fisheries and Oceans.
That is correct.
Okay. So as you heard me outline for the Commissioner, what we want to do today is go through some of the background for what's known as the FRSSI model. And just to recap, we've heard from Mr. Grout and from Mr. Rosenberger and others about how the FRSSI model is used in in-season planning. Oh, sorry, your CV that I just reviewed with you, I need to mark that as an exhibit.
Exhibit 394.
So we have heard from people so far in this commission about the use of the FRSSI model. Just to set some background, it's a tool that's used by the department in setting escapement targets for Fraser River Sockeye. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct, Mr. Commissioner. It was developed to help guide with some consistent principles in a open method to advise, or at least allow managers to assess the consequences of different alternative harvest strategies.
Okay, so just before we get to the FRSSI model, I think it's useful to just know where we came from. And I just want to ask if in '96, when the setting of escapement targets became the responsibility of the department following the '85 treaty, were you involved in setting escapement targets at that time?
My capacity at that time was technical support for a working team, Mr. Commissioner, that was developing this so-called 1987 rebuilding plan.
Okay. And that rebuilding plan, was that a plan developed to help the department set escapement goals for Fraser River Sockeye?
The way I would, that's correct. The way I would characterize it is that it was an experiment to test the production levels for the purpose of increasing, or at least assessing how much production in terms of yield could be achieved, given the uncertainty at the time about what the habitat capacity was and the productivity of Fraser Sockeye. So, yes.
Right, if you could turn to tab 5 of the binder before you. This is CAN 185434. It's described as a draft document, December 1988. But I understand this to be an outline of the 1987 rebuilding strategy. Have you seen this before?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, and then is it as I described?
Yes.
Okay, can I have that marked, please, as the next exhibit?
Exhibit number 395.
Thank you. There's a few terms that I think might be useful for you to give us an understanding of, because they do come up again and again during escapement planning and harvest management planning. And I wonder if you could just explain what the term a fixed escapement strategy or a fixed escapement policy is.
A fixed escapement strategy, in theory, is one of, say, three classes of strategies, but it really refers to a plan, a management plan that allows a fixed or constant number of spawners to reach the spawning grounds in order to result in recruitment and sustaining populations. So it is a term that's used to describe a particular management strategy that puts the same number of spawners on the spawning ground, Mr. Commissioner, year after year.
And then the harvest would be anything in excess of that fixed escapement goal?
That's correct. Exploitation rate is where a fixed or constant removal rate of the abundance of fish that is the target for fisheries. So, for example, a 60% harvest rate would mean that 60% of the available fish would be removed from a fishery, and that would be allow some sharing at that level. 60% goes to catch, and 40% would then be the escapement target. There are nuances of that, which would include, for Fraser Sockeye, the management adjustment, for example, for accounting for environmental conditions in the river. But fixed escapement and fixed exploitation rate strategies are the two classic management models, if you like, for managing fisheries.
Okay, thank you. Now, the 1987 rebuilding strategy, can you describe what that is, and if it's helpful to talk about fixed escapement or fixed harvest rates in the context of that plan, then please do so.
Yeah, Mr. Commissioner, at the time in the late or the mid 80s, with the signing of the Salmon Treaty, there was added benefits to Canada inferred by the treaty, and so there was a process at the time which had some buy-in from industry to attempt to rebuild escapements and hence returns on the Fraser with the purpose of increasing the returns and hence the yield. And this was planned over a 3 to 4 generation period, which is, in terms of Fraser Sockeye, of 12 to 16 years. So from, say, 87 up to 2002, in that range, this plan was in operation. And it essentially developed a strategy for increasing escapements at intervals over the rebuilding period. It was designed to reduce harvest rates that were at the time in the order of 75% or higher, to reduce harvest rates to 65, 75% in that range, a minimum of 60, I believe. But the notion was Mr. Commissioner, was to increase escapements that was with interim goals that were set for each of the cycle lines, and the goals were described as interim because there was high uncertainty based on a couple of sources of analyses. One was the estimates at the time of spawning ground capacity, estimates at the time of the rearing or in-lake capacity, if you like, which were quite different. And so there was this uncertainty about what exactly we may be able to build to in order to increase production yield on the system. And so there was interim escapement goals set to reach the interim, or an attempt to reach the interim goals over the course of 12 to 16 years, or 3 to 4 cycles. And so now that's the premise of the 87 rebuilding plan. And at the time, there had been fair success in rebuilding or increasing escapements before the signing of the treaty, and going way back to, post Hell's Gate Slide in 1913. the old International Pacific Salmon Fishery Commission had increased escapements and increased the returns of most of the productive stocks, those stocks which contributed to the main economic yield at the time. So in 1987, or post-Pacific Salmon Treaty, Canada, again with the benefit of receiving the gains, invested in a rebuilding plan that, as I said, was designed to increase escapements with foregone catch in the early years, so that there would be some economic loss, certainly in the early years of the plan, and that with the hope of achieving higher economic yields through rebuilding and to assessing the factors that are responsible for maintaining production on the Fraser. Now, so that was from the outset. That was the intent of the plan, and so. But by the time the mid-90s rolled around, there was indications that productivity was declining, and the plan, as it was set at that time, Mr. Commissioner, was therefore somewhat constrained because of the one of the rules was to maintain at a minimum the brood year escapement. In other words, you wouldn't go below in a given year. You wouldn't have a target that was designed to go below the target, say 4 years before. And otherwise, it would not have been a rebuilding strategy. But the intent was to, of course, take advantage of those years where productivity was on the rise. And but then, as I said, starting in around the mid-90s, when things started to slide, there was concern certainly amongst the stakeholders who had invested in in this rebuilding plan that things have gotten off the rails, and that the benefit that they were potentially would have reaped had productivity not declined was in their minds not to be realized. So that was sort of where I would say. In 2000, 2002, with the decline and the loss of yield that was not achieved, that's where rethinking about the 87 plan started to take hold.
And do you know why be a decline in the later years?
Why there was a decline in productivity?
Why the stocks didn't rebuild in the way that was anticipated under the rebuilding strategy?
Yeah, we didn't understand why it was declining. I mean, there's a number of hypotheses that you will hear or have heard throughout these proceedings, but the current thinking, I guess, was that productivity was declining because of changing environmental conditions, primarily in the ocean. And it was a natural occurrence, and part of fluctuating changes in productivity over time. But in this particular case, in the 1990s, it turned out to be a rather persistent decline.
Rebuilding strategy, did the escapement targets that were set using that policy or that rebuilding strategy, did those targets take into account cyclic dominance of Fraser River stocks?
There was, as part of the design of the rebuilding plan, the population dynamics, the models at the time that were designed to attempt to represent the population dynamics of Fraser Sockeye had taken into account or had considered models that accounted for the cycles that had been seen in the Fraser system. As well as and that has been called the Ricker model, which we'll talk about later, I'm guessing, the Larkin model rather. And then there is a Ricker model which it did not purport to account for cycles in terms of interactions between the different year classes. In answer to your question, though, Mr. Commissioner, there was an attempt at the time to assess rebuilding plans based on the notion that needed to account for cycles in the populations.
All right, now just to kind of carry the sequence, around, you said 2000 to 2002, there started to be some concern that the rebuilding strategy wasn't working, and I take it that the department started to look at new ways to determine escapement strategies?
That is correct.
And there was an initiative that began in 2002, which is known as the Fraser River Sockeye Spawning Initiative, or FRSSI, and that is a modeling tool, and that was developed as a way to look at new ways to develop escapement strategies.
Yes, that's correct. I should have added, though, that in terms of the 1987 rebuilding plan, there was also an experimental plan that was designed to reduce harvest rates rather aggressively down to 50% to learn more quickly about which dynamics may have been affecting or are affecting or important to understand in managing Fraser sockeye. So the FRSSI, which is the question that you're asking, or the Spawning Escapement Initiative, was really trying to look at a fresh look of how you actually balance or assess the trade-offs between reaching spawning escapement targets to avoid having stocks, or in the vernacular of the wild salmon policy, CUs, which would be at risk because of low escapements or low numbers of spawners reaching the spawning grounds. So when we say escapement, Mr. Commissioner, we're talking about escapement targets. We're talking about ensuring or considering the trade-offs in the management system that would allow us some certainty of maintaining or reaching spawning targets, reaching the number of the spawners that on the spawning grounds for future propagation of the and sustainability of the population. And so, but then obviously, so one objective was to ensure that escapements targets were reached. Another objective was to balance the rate at which escapement targets were achieved, or at least the amount of escapement that reached the spawning grounds, with harvest management. And so FRSSI was really a method or a tool that takes into account, one, the population dynamics, the biology of the beast, as well as the objectives of management in terms of realized catch. And so a set of performance indicators or performance measures were developed to try to assess how well you met those objectives. And in a sense, that is the nutshell, or at least the overriding purpose of FRSSI, was within a consistent framework, allow the inclusion of what we know about the biology, i.e. the population dynamics that are described by currently at least the Rickard model and a Larkin model, but also to include the objectives that were at the time starting to be thought of in a more of an open process. In the ensuing years after 2004, certainly there was a series of public engagements in terms of workshops to elicit preferences by stakeholders in attempt to identify the range of preferences that would become the objectives, and then also to build on the understanding of what is our understanding of the population dynamics. Which model should we use, taking into account uncertainty?
Okay, let me break some of that down. That's quite a big history there. So, if I can take you to a paper that you authored in 2004, this is in tab 1 of the binder before you, and it's CAN 002790. And this is a research paper prepared by you, Michael Folks, and Godfrey Pestel, called Methods for Assessing Harvest Rules for Fraser River Sockeye Salmon. Just before I ask the question about this document, if I could just back up and ask you, FRSSI has a model component, but it also has a process component that you were just alluding to at the end there in terms of workshopping with stakeholders and others. Is that a fair characterization?
Yes, that's a fair characterization, yes.
Okay, so this paper, I take it, goes to the analytical tool, like the mathematical model that is part of FRSSI, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, and can you give us an overview of what this paper in 2004 and the model that was developed at that time was intended to do? How does it work?
Yeah, okay, just some context. This was the first scientific review, if you like, of a few years of work that started in 2002 and led up to the development of this particular research project, or sorry, research report. research document in the vernacular of CSAS. And so it was a description of the methodology that was used at the time to provide management input and ultimately to set escapement goals for Fraser Sockeye. And as I was saying, it describes the biological components, the models that were considered at that time, as well as the objectives that were considered at the time. And it, two things that are I guess, the main features I think that are worth pointing out in this particular paper compared to where we are now is that these were the early years of development of this model within a technical group. And so we explored what's the range of methods that we should be exploring in terms of assessing the stock dynamics of the model. So we considered a Ricker model, and we considered a rudimentary model, in my words, that looked at just the data in the very dominant years, and also in a Larkin model. So it had some models which are not included now in the way that we describe the biology. It also used a harvest rate curve that is quite different than what is applied now. And this particular curve was solved for, if you like, analytically, given the underlying biology and given the objectives, but it could not be described as a fixed escapement policy because it did have this notion of increasing escapement at higher run sizes, but also not in the theoretical sense a fixed exploitation rate policy, in that it did not have a constant harvest rate policy at over some range of run sizes. So, and that's quite different than what's done today. So, and I can talk about what changes were made from that particular construct. The other thing was that we changed the shape of we had a particular curve that is different that we use today, but we also had a different way of evaluating how the curve should look, and this was in the spirit, if you like, of optimization. It's got various jargons attached to it, but solving for multi-attributes within a modeling context that actually weighted different attributes of a function. So, for example, one of them might be to avoid low number of spawners, avoid low catch, and maintain catch at some constant level. So those are three objectives that would be built into this multi-objective function. And then stakeholders would then, in terms of their preference, weight each of those objectives, and then that would be solved analytically. So the curve that would be the outcome of this would be determined by how you might choose to weight the various factors that were in this objective function. So typically would weight the avoid low spawner objective at a higher rate than avoid the low catch objective, or maybe not. So, but that was the state of this particular paper, and so Wendy, that's kind of where we got to in the 2004 review that occurred.
You mentioned that this model, once it was presented, was then followed with workshops with different stakeholder groups to work through some of the objectives that you just identified. Is that right?
Most of the stakeholder kind of involvement started to occur. Now, maybe this might be a good question for the panel, but I think 2005 is where we felt the model's at a state where it was we thought it would benefit from inputs from a broader stakeholder community. So we started on this road of having multiple staged workshops that helped inform the development of the tool and helped solicit preferences from the various stakeholders. involved in the process.
Okay, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. You also had I take it there was a workshop that dealt with cyclic dominance and its application to the goals that are described here in 2006. Do you remember that?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, and then proceedings from that 2006 workshop are at tab 9 of the binder before you, and it's CAN 002835. And what was the...
Ms. Baker, did you want to mark that?
Oh, sorry, yes, please, mark that.
Marked as Exhibit 396.
So the proceedings from the workshop on cyclic dominance, why was this done? Why was there a workshop to assess population dynamics and implications for management?
Mr. Commissioner, this was one of the most widely debated scientific issues that has emerged in the last 50 years with regard to Fraser Sockeye, which is to address the question of why is it that we see in subpopulations in the large lake systems, in particular of Fraser Sockeye, that have persistent cycles, have had persistent cycles back to the origins of data, in which you have varying patterns that emerge, but the most striking was you had a very strong, what was called a dominant year within the 4-year cycle, followed by a lesser, what was called a subdominant year, followed by 2 off cycles. And for some populations, that particular pattern, for example, Quesnel Lake Sockeye, Adams River Sockeye, Stewart Lake Sockeye, that pattern has persisted with uncanny regularity over time. And so, as I said, in 50 years of scientific inquiry, there has been no consensus on what exactly is the cause of these cycles. And so the workshop that, the proceedings that are before us, the workshop was an attempt to bring together the issues in a DFO-sponsored workshop, but that also included academics from UBC and SFU, if you like, as well. But it was to start looking at how we could deal with cyclic dominance in the context of its implications for management, for management of Fraser River Sockeye. So it was seen as something that needed to be done in order to move forward on how we would incorporate this notion of cycles in the population dynamics of Fraser Sockeye and in the simulation testing that went forward to account for cycles. So that was the impetus, the motivation, Mr. Commissioner, for this particular workshop at that time.
And I'll have the proceedings marked, please, as the next exhibit.
Exhibit 397.
Did the workshop result in changes being made to the FRSSI model?
This was, in my mind, sort of the fundamental workshop that reshaped how we proceeded forward from what's documented in the 2004 CSAS research document. And the fundamental change was an acceptance that probably the best way to model the dynamics of Fraser Sockeye was to include this so-called Larkin model, which essentially is a Ricker model, but with some added terms to account for the importance of previous spawning escapements on determining the survival of a brood year, in the sense that there was a delay density impact depending on the size of the spawn, numbers of spawners, and on the degree of interaction between the spawners. So essentially it was a way to account for the cycles in terms of how these particular year classes interacted to result in differences in mortality associated and driving cycles. So that was one fundamental change, I think, in the way that we chose to model the population dynamics in the FRSSI model. The other, I think, fundamental change was in the way that the harvest rule it changed from how it was characterized in the 2004 document to how it exists now. And it was recognized at the workshop that by trying to optimize a particular curve to meet some objectives was not a fixed exploitation rate strategy, nor was it a fixed escapement strategy, but that the more appropriate way to manage according to a rule was to have a fixed exploitation rate applied across a large run size range with some contingency for ramping down that harvest rate at low run size abundances. And so that was the second sort of fundamental change in the way that the tool was designed. So the shape of the harvest rule curve, or what's called a total allowable mortality curve now, it was changed and is quite different from what was reported in the 2004 report. Another thing that occurred around that time was, well, maybe I'll leave it there because I think that's the fundamental importance of that particular workshop at that time.
And just as we're talking about the curves and the harvest rules, I think it might be helpful for the Commissioner to relate that discussion to an example of an escapement strategy that was in use, or is currently in use, and we've already gone to it once in these proceedings, the 2009 escapement strategy, which is Exhibit 322. We turned in that to page number 9. You relate what you were just talking about to this curve?
Yes, so the top curve, if you look at the run sizes, which is shown on the bottom axis, the x-axis in millions. So this is a range of run size over which a harvest curve has been developed. So in this example, at 1 million fish, there is a dotted line, vertical dotted line, that represents a point on that curve where you would start ramping down on the total allowable mortality, which is shown on the vertical axis as a total allowable mortality, which would include harvest. And so the cap, which is described as the cap at right at the point of a 1 million run size, is the exploitation rate cap that would be applied to a particular run if the run was above, in this case, 1 million fish. And so as the run, if a run comes in below 1 million fish, then the harvest rule implies that you would reduce harvest rates in the way this curve is shown down to a minimal fishing point at somewhere below 500,000 fish, and then minimal fishing from then on. Now, so that's the relationship between the run size, Mr. Commissioner, that would be observed, and the total allowable mortality, which would include harvest. Now, if you flip that and ask how that translates into an escapement strategy, and you can see from the plot at the bottom of that figure 1, that between what is that point just below 500,000 fish and the 1 million fish, where those two vertical lines are, the strategy there is to have a fixed escapement strategy over that range of the run size that corresponded to the decline, or the cutback in the harvest rate should the run size in this particular example fall below 1 million fish. And then to the left of the dotted line, the vertical dotted line, which is called the no fishing point on the top graph, results in a decline in escapement. There's no fishing, but as run size declines, the escapement will also decline. So this is if you like, really the fundamental way in which the tool, the harvest rule, or I keep calling it a harvest rule because of my lengthy history in this, but which is now called the total allowable or TAM rule. This is the construct that exists today.
Right, and these curves are generated through the model that you have just been talking about. There's a range of curves that would be used to
assess whether how well a particular curve, total allowable mortality rule, how well that worked in meeting the objectives of not falling below a particular spawning escapement with some frequency, say 9 out of 10 over the course of the forward simulations. And I lost my train of thought, but could you help me, Wendy?
I was asking if the curve that you see there is what's created by the use of the FRSSI model, and then you were explaining that the different curves can be created.
Sorry, the particular curve that satisfies the constraints, that is, you don't want to fall below the spawning escapement or don't want to fall below some particular catch value.
Sorry, I'll just ask if you could turn to page CAN 15, and that may help you in explaining what you're talking about now. Go up, show the whole page if you could. There, you see the different options at the bottom.
Right, so at the bottom, those are in fact the harvest control rules, or the TAM rules, and then the panel at the top corresponds to the performance indicators, in this case for early Stewart sockeye, that over the long haul would result from applying these various options. And so ultimately, there's a large number of options that you run with this model and are assessed against performance indicators, and those harvest rules or inputs that do not meet the options, for example, do not meet the performance of, or the goal of avoiding low spawners by some frequency, then those are filtered out. Likewise, or could be filtered out. Likewise, options that result in catches that fall below some agreed to level get filtered out. So the notion here is to, Mr. Commissioner, is to exclude those options which do not satisfy the objectives, and to, if you like, home in on a set of objectives that satisfy, or home in on a set of curves, if you like, that meet the objectives based on the performance indicators that are identified.
Okay. And the idea of having a fixed exploitation rate ceiling, the 60%, was that a new addition in 2006 following the workshop as well?
Yeah. So then it became, okay, what do you set the cap at? Once we agreed that the control rule would be a fixed exploitation rate across a range of run sizes, then the question is, what would you set the total allowable mortality rule at? And so it's at that stage where we, throughout the workshop environment, came to a value of 60%. And it's important, I think, to note that that's not based on an outcome from modeling the population dynamics for the stocks that we had included in the model. It was designed to reduce the probability of doing harm, if you like, to stocks that had a lower productivity that weren't reflected in the model. So it was a way to guard against populations, reduce the harvest rate from what might be the optimal, to guard against overfishing small stocks in mixed stock fisheries. It was also designed to mitigate, if you like, or reduce the impact of uncertainty in-season management, so uncertainty in run sizes, that higher exploitation rates could have the undesirable impact of removing too many fish if the run size was estimated to be lower than it actually was. And it also guarded against what's been called sort of implementation error. You can't precisely implement a fishery with an exact harvest rate, so there's some uncertainty about what exactly the harvest rate you can achieve given your target. And so those three things resulted in a policy choice, if you like, to have a 60% cap, which is what's currently in the plan.
Speaker, can I just ask so I continue to follow this evidence, just ask a question of the witness. Earlier on, Mr. Cass, you talked about fixed harvest or exploitation rate, and there you talked about 60% as an example. I've heard about total allowable catch, or TAC, and now you're talking about TAM. Are all these terms the same?
They're not the same. They're related, and they're part of the jargon in this whole affair. But a total allowable mortality rate, if you like, includes a harvest rate, and the harvest rate would determine the TAC. So translate the harvest rate applied to a run size, the total allowable catch, the TAC, would fall out from that. But the TAM includes the harvest rate that would ultimately result in a TAC, but also include environmental losses that are developed through the management adjustment.
So environmental losses that are...
Environmental losses in the river that would be projected based on environmental conditions in a given year, which would be removed from what would be allowed to be taken.
These are what have been referred to as management adjustment numbers. Is that right?
Yes.
So we've started to talk about management adjustments, Mr. Commissioner, but that evidence has not been completed yet.
Yeah, maybe a different way to say it is there are projected losses in the river because of environmental high river temperatures, high flows, for example, removals of catch upriver, unaccounted for removals of catch. So those would be, if you sum those all up in a given year, those would be subtracted from the total number of fish that would enter the river, but would eventually result in less fish reaching the spawning grounds. They would be fish that would be either caught or die en route towards the spawning grounds, but that would be reduce the actual number that reached the spawning grounds. So the TAM rule was a way to account for that those differences.
You had talked about this idea of weighting different objectives, that how you might weight some more heavily than others in the prior version, the 2004 version. Was that continued following the 2006 workshop, that weighting of objectives?
The weights, explicit weights that were used to sort of as knobs on this objective function were not used following, I think they were disbanded probably in the plan for 2006, and went to more, as I was trying to describe, went to more of assessing the range of options available in terms of a TAM rule and how they satisfied the meeting the objectives in terms of the performance measures that were used to assess the performance of how each of these TAM rules performed.
Okay. When did the FRSSI model when was the first use of the FRSSI model in setting options for Fraser River Sockeye escapement planning?
The TAM rule first appears formally as a method for guiding escapement targets options. Occurred in 2006, I believe, IFMP. It had been used in 2005 as sort of transition between the rebuilding plan, if you like, and into FRSSI, but it was not explicitly used on its own in 2005. 2006 marked the first year that its influence on setting escapement targets was used.
And where have changes been made since to the model?
There's been a number of changes made to the model, to the actual biological model, the tool, if you like, Mr. Commissioner. There was certainly, at the time, an interest in developing plausible forward simulations that accounted for changing productivity over time. So given the atmosphere at the time, or conditions at the time, that populations were declining, there was an interest in looking at more research or more assessment of how you evaluate the impacts of changing future productivity changes over time. That was key to the changes that were made in around 2005 and built on right up till now. There was also changes or thinking around how you include the en route mortality remove the effect or partition the effect of environmental conditions in the river from the actual harvest rate or the human removal. There has been thinking around how you account for declines in productivity at very low stock sizes. That's this so-called depensatory effect, that if you, in theory, that if you cross or have spawning escapements that are below a certain level, then the high productivity that is modeled, if you do not consider losses that occur, other losses that occur at low spawning escapements, will overestimate the productivity in that range. And the causes of this, what's in this depensation thinking, is that genetic effects that perhaps fish can't. They get so low in abundance they can't find mates. Genetic bottlenecks, predators that Mr. Commissioner, that could swamp out low abundances of their prey, in this case Fraser sockeye, if they're at such low abundance. So the FRSSI model, well, it didn't purport to estimate what that degree of depensation was. It just as in trying to account for future changes in productivity, the future model allowed users of the model, if you like, to run scenarios that included this kind of low mortality at low stock sizes, to assess the impact of that on the actual long-term harvest strategy that would result from including depensation, including things like various scenarios of future productivity, declines in productivity, and how you model en route mortality to potentially account for increases that may occur over time as a result of climate change. Those were some of the changes that have been made, in addition to ongoing data refinements. So we moved from 12 stocks that had the longest data set of the spawning and escapement data set. We added on 7 more populations that had, or stocks that had, less routine data and higher uncertainty in the actual the population models, the parameters that are the outcome of these models. And so we moved from 12 stocks to 19 stocks, and we, as each year went on, we added on additional years of data, and so there were some refinements of the actual data and the models that were used.
Okay, the depensatory effect that you just mentioned there in that answer, I wonder if you could explain that more simply, just so that we have it on the record. That concept, if I understand it, is that if you can imagine productivity on a slope, the theory is, and I think the way the model was originally run was that the lower the number of spawners, the higher the productivity of those spawners. But there's some point on that line where that theory stops working, right? And you can actually have lower productivity with a lower number of spawners.
Yeah, it's been called a number of things, a predator pit, but whatever the cause, yeah, if you don't account for that and it actually exists, then you're overestimating the productivity in that range of the low stock size. Correct.
What about all these things that you've just described? Are those a kind of sensitivity analysis? Is that how you would explain some of those factors you've just reviewed?
Yes. So sensitivity analysis, Mr. Commissioner, would be a way within the simulation testing to evaluate how important various assumptions, in this case, various assumptions about future changes in productivity, various assumptions about depensatory mortality, various assumptions about en route mortality, how that translates into an outcome in terms of the a harvest rule or the behavior of the performance indicators that you're using to come up with the harvest or allowable TAM rule. So the idea behind sensitivity analysis is, one, to assess what's the influence of assumptions going into the model, and then to evaluate whether there are robust management procedures that can alleviate to the best extent the occurrence of those factors that may or may not occur.
Godfrey Pestle, Paul Ryle, and you prepared a report on the development of FRSSI, and that included a number of the improvements that you've just reviewed and outlined some of the workshops that were held with participants over the years. And that document is called Collaborative Development of Escapement Strategies for Fraser River Sockeye, a summary report 2003 to 2008, and it's tab 3 in the binder, and it's CAN 002907. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And this document sets out the history, really, of how the model was developed and what workshops were held with different stakeholders and the outcomes of those workshops and sort of the refinements to the model as time went on. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. Can I have that marked, please, as the next exhibit?
Exhibit 398.
But it's 25 in the actual body of the document. That sets out the simulation model. This is, again, just a summary of the model that you've been talking about. But at the bottom, it might be helpful for the Commissioner just to outline, you have some policy choices set out there. And are these the kinds of choices that FRSSI is designed to allow managers and stakeholders to assess? For example, policy choice trade-off between harvest benefits versus providing protection to individual stocks. Policy choice 2, trade-off between short-term and long-term benefits. Policy choice 3, trade-off between stability in catch and maximizing opportunity.
Yes.
Okay. And those sorts of policies, how are those policies incorporated into the model or dealt with in the model? Can you just give the Commissioner an understanding of how that fairly non-mathematical sort of summary finds its way into this model and this process?
Yeah, first of all, I think it's, Mr. Commissioner, we need to understand that this is a long-term way or a model that looks at long-term strategies, if you like. In this particular case, it goes out to 48 years. And so it's important to realize that it's assessing the trade-offs in terms of harvest benefits as well as sustaining escapement in a long-term sense. Now, the model has been and can be used to look at more shorter-term trade-offs, and this was an interest by stakeholders, if you like, to sort of separate in terms of 8 years versus the long term. But yeah, essentially it's in terms of trade-offs, and given the harvest rule that was just described, or the TAM rule that was just described, it's a way of looking at given some objectives, don't want to fall below a certain number of spawners, and don't want to have the catch. Now that's a stock-specific or CU-specific objective. Don't want the catch to fall below some particular low catch limit, which would, from the perspective of stakeholders, is not a desirable outcome. And so essentially the model then looks at how can you meet those objectives and satisfy the interests of conservation. What particular harvest control or TAM rule is best for reducing the impact or staying above some particular benchmark, i.e. don't want to result in a conservation risk, and at the same time to result in the best harvest benefit given those constraints. And so the choice 3, which really refers to you could maximize catch, but you would have potentially high variability from year to year, whereas the long-term catch, which might satisfy the best long-term catch, but which results in higher frequency from one year to the next of whether you get good catches in one year and poor catches in the following year. So the simulation model was set up to explore those choices and ultimately to come up with a plan, i.e. a TAM rule that met the performance, the preferences that were used to evaluate these trade-offs.
If you could turn then to page 39, or CAN 39, which is page 31 in the actual report, and go down to the bottom of that page. It sets out how alternative escapement strategies were chosen, and if we read at the bottom and turn over the page, this document describes how the spawning initiative workshops went through some of those choices and identified the different trade-off options. You'll see that there's a bullet at the top of the page which you can go past, and then the first bullet following says participants were asked to assign preference scores to different management objectives and performance indicators. The next bullet describes how they were asked to assign preference scores to alternative options. And then finally, there's a review of the trade-off analysis that showed where things landed following these workshops and where the participants settled on their different options. And that sort of describes, what happened at those workshops where people tried to work their way through this model and work their way through different performance indicators and objectives to come up with what was going to be workable going forward?
Yes, that's correct. That was the idea, to look at the broad suite of outcomes from the model, and given the objectives and the preferences of those at the workshops, at least, a way to render down, if you like, the various options down into a set of options, and eventually a single option that would be part of the plan.
And the third bullet under the paragraph that begins with the word briefly, it says options deliberately designed as a compromise weren't strongly rejected or endorsed, and established a middle ground that served as a platform for the 2007 preseason planning. And is that what happened, in fact?
Yeah, this was the sort of search for the common ground among the participants.
And just to identify, the participants at those workshops are set out, or at least some of them are set out on page CAN 3, which is Roman numeral 3 on this document. It sets out some of the individuals who attended the workshops in 2007 and 2008. That's right?
That's correct.
Okay. Can I ask you to identify whether the FRSSI model at this time in 2008 was able to model the effect of the rules on overlapping runtiming groups, or did it simply address a TAM rule on each runtiming group in isolation from each other?
Yeah, now, before I saw this document, I couldn't pin down the chronology very well, but yeah, the idea was that it's recognized that the TAM rules were modeled on runtiming groups that themselves contained were a roll-up of various stocks that were assumed to be have similar timing groups. So the history of it is, you have the early Stewart, which is a timing group which in many respects is the first. It overlaps to some extent, but is usually passed through the system before the large summer groups. But the summer, early summer, and lates all have timing group, or their timing groups have some overlap. So the way to assess the impacts of the overlap, in other words, to take into account that the TAM rules could well be different on each of the run timing groups. Where they overlapped, there was a need to account for the fact that there would be constraints on a harvest rate, simply because the overlap of and mixture of the stocks within a timing group that overlapped may have had a TAM rule that is different than what is what would be operating on another run timing group, Mr. Commissioner. So the idea was to assess what the actual realized harvest rate would be given the constraints of the TAM rule on in overlapping stocks. So within the model, to assess that, there was a need or an interest in doing some simultaneous modeling of each of the run timing groups to estimate what the impact of the overlap would be.
All right, and has that been done?
There are methods that are applied currently with that objective, yes.
The FRSSI model does create TAM rules for these run timing groups that we've heard a lot about in these proceedings, and run timing groups or management groups, but the steward and the summer and the early summer and the late runs. Could you do escapement strategies using the FRSSI model for a different set of groups or for the individual 19 stocks that are modeled in it? Is that possible?
Well, Mr. Commissioner, you can, because we have the information for each of the discrete populations that get rolled up into the run timing groups, you can come up with a TAM rule for each of those populations. However, implementing that particular strategy, in other words, if you were attempting to manage each of those populations in mixed stock fishery environments where there are certain sampling requirements or precision requirements in test fisheries or within the in-season inputs, there are problems associated with, certainly with small stocks in large populations that are sampled in attempting to estimate what's the abundance of each stock is. So the more populations you have within a mixture that you assume within a mixture, there's an issue with one stock ID in the actual fisheries based on the test fisheries to estimate the abundance of the larger number of stocks that would be managed for in the example that council has used. So one of the big drawbacks is the precision of the stock ID for small runs. There's also issues related to the fact that we have en route mortality, which is based on a run timing group. So we have estimates of en route mortality in the river based on run timing groups, and not currently isolated by stocks. So there's some loss of precision there. But you know that's something that maybe one could test. I would say the major problem, Mr. Commissioner, with trying to manage large numbers of populations in mixed stock fisheries is the current sampling regime in test fisheries that does not result in precise or accurate estimates, particularly of small stocks.
Right now, we talked about the 60% ceiling, and you described that as being kind of a management decision that was made to put the ceiling at 60%. Did you consider trying to understand the optimal ceiling for the stocks that are made up within any given aggregate? Like, why is it always 60% and not different for different run timing groups?
Yes, I did mention that the 60% was a policy choice given the data gaps and the inability to account for all the populations, all the stocks that would be within a timing group. So that's an area where I would say some priority in terms of research should be attacked. I mean, we have assumed a 60% since the outset of the IFMPs, but that's an area where we need to look at the from a scientific point of view, given the understanding about population dynamics about that. But I don't think we're going to completely solve the problem. There may be populations that have a low productivity that aren't accounted for in the suite of stocks that we currently use, and certainly the small populations would not be, if they're very small, very difficult to detect in the test fisheries.
And there's also, as you'll recall from looking at the graph when we had it on the screen, and maybe it'd be helpful, Mr. Lund, to put Exhibit 322 back up on the screen and go to page 15, CAN 15 in that document. Just might be useful to have that while I'm asking these questions. So the 60% that we were just talking about is that top line on the escapement strategies table or graph, right?
Yes.
Okay, and then there's also a no fishing point, which is the bottom 0% line. How is that no fishing point set using FRSSI or in FRSSI?
Well, the way the TAM rule is set up now with a fixed exploitation rate over a wide range of run sizes and a ramping down at some point. The way the TAM rule is set up now, with a fixed exploitation rate over the period that that triggers the reduction in harvest rate, because of the fixed exploitation rate at that period, the actual no fishing point is simply falls out from trying to find that one point on that curve that determines the cutback rule, given that you have a fixed escapement below that.
All right, and what is that cutback rule related to? Is it related to a benchmark of some kind?
Yes. So the benchmarks that we have been using, the interim benchmarks up till now, the cutback is designed to look at the frequency of a particular TAM rule that results in a that compares or looks at the frequency with which a particular a rule would result in an escapement that is below or doesn't meet the benchmark.
All right, and the interim benchmark that you describe is a number of fish that you don't want to fish below, right? Just in plain language?
In the WSP language, it's a value or an escapement or that is considered to be put the CU at risk, and it's actually defined as in various ways, but it's really some proportion, if you like, or some number less than a fully seeded population. So it's really the point between the red and the amber in the WSP diagram that's often used to show the health of a CU in terms of its abundance level.
All right, and those interim benchmarks that you've described, those are interim. Why? Why are they still interim?
Well, I mean, we started the FRSSI process started before the WSP was finalized, and certainly it's carried on during the implementation phase, Mr. Commissioner, of the WSP. But interim benchmarks were used as surrogates or proxies, if you like, to guide the process up until the point when we actually do adopt the WSP benchmarks. So the WSP benchmarks would be, once they're finalized and agreed to, would be used as they would be used as the actual benchmarks, and there would no longer be interim benchmarks.
Okay, thank you. And then I just have a couple of questions left, and we'll be able to take a break, and then we'll move to the full panel. So I'll just try and get through that next set of questions. In 2010, there was a CSAP review of the FRSSI model. Is that right?
Correct.
And the paper which outlines that review is found at tab 6, which is CAN 185438. So this is a working paper prepared by Godfrey Pestle, Anne-Marie Huang, and you appear as the third author, and the FRSSI working group. You're familiar with this document?
Yes.
Okay, I'll have this marked, please.
Exhibit number 399.
Thank you. All right. Why was this review done in 2010?
It was felt that there had been progress made on a number of fronts in the development of FRSSI since the last peer review, the last PSARC review in 2004. So this was really a catch-up to document and have review of the current state as it existed at that time.
And this document appears as a working paper, so it's unlike the 2004 document that we've marked as an exhibit in this proceeding. How far along the process is this document now? Is it now finalized?
This document is not finalized. It was reviewed, as you said, I think in May. And the report was accepted, endorsed, if you like, by the participants at the meeting, which means that the methodology as it was presented in the paper is accepted. So the loose ends, if you like, Mr. Commissioner, are that it's accepted, but with revisions, which is usually the case in reviews. So as long as the authors or the leads on a particular research paper agree to revise the paper pending the recommendations from the actual peer review process. The paper is not accepted until the revisions are made, at which time, if the revisions meet the standards and are agreed to by the chair of the meeting, then the paper stands as a research document, which would be, in this case, the course of events. I might say that the methodology was strongly supported by external reviews, and so it was a good signal that we're on that the process was, that the tool itself was on the right track. So that's, Mr. Commissioner, where this sits now. There's also, Ms. Baker, I'm not sure if you want me to go here, but there's also a product that comes out of these peer review meetings that's called the Science Advisory Report, which isn't authored by individuals. It's a summary, if you like, of the peer review meeting, and it's authored by DFO, and that is the actual advice that flows from the meeting in terms of the acceptance of the paper and the review. So there's these two documents, if you like, which will neither of which are finalized and approved, which would be the outputs from these meetings, this meeting.
For our purposes, does Exhibit 399 that you see before you, does that set out the state of the model that is currently in use?
That is correct. Now, yeah, it's the model that is currently developed that could be used by end users, put it that way.
But the tool, I guess, that is described in that document, through Exhibit 399, is the tool that's available for the department to use in
That's correct.
Doing its planning. Okay. I take it one of the things that this paper, the Exhibit 399, didn't address is whether the FRSSI model is an appropriate tool for using to use in making management decisions. Is that fair? It reviews the model, but it doesn't kind of look at that broad overview of, is this the best tool or should we be using this?
The model, I must say, doesn't come from a vacuum. It, Mr. Commissioner, is the current thinking globally, if you like, on how you do these kinds of policy evaluations. And so it's really, I think, considered certainly by reviewers and experts who work in these kinds of environments, that it does represent the state of the art, if you like, for how you evaluate fisheries management and outcomes in terms of preferences as far as meeting objectives and doing it in an open, transparent, consistent framework.
This model, I guess, has been in use for 4 years, going on 5 years. So you've seen one full cycle come back after using the model. Is it intended that there will be a further review to see if the model is performing and it's a useful tool in management planning for Fraser River Sockeye?
My understanding that is correct. So each year that we apply the model, or if it gets used in setting escapement targets, is a learning experience. So after one complete cycle, it was agreed that we would review where we stood at that point, which would be, I guess, 2011. Yeah, so it would be a review of the performance of this model.
And is that happening now? Is there a review like that in place?
The review is not in place as yet.
Is it intended for this year, 2011?
It was intended to be this year. Whether or not that will occur, I don't know.
All right. Thank you. Mr. Commissioner, I think this would be a good time to break, and I'll bring the panel up after the break to complete the evidence on this.
Can I just ask a couple of questions before the full panel comes on, Mr. Cass? Do I understand your evidence to be that there were two unknowns, if I can use that term, that you described earlier? One was you described a pattern of persistent decline in the stocks. And I think you mentioned the mid-1990s or thereabouts. And the other was you mentioned a persistent pattern of the dominant cycles followed by subdominant. So both of those were unknowns in the
Well,
context.
certainly, the decline in production that you referred to first, it was occurring.
No, I apologize. I think I may have misled you. Not unknown in the sense that it was occurring, but unknown in the sense as to why it was occurring.
That's correct. That is
And
correct.
similarly with the persistent decline, why that was occurring. So you had two patterns that you didn't have knowledge of as to the why, or an answer as to why they were occurring.
Yes, the cyclic dominance, the persistent pattern of high-low populations over time. I mean, it's quite apparent in the data. And given how apparent it is in the data, there was no scientific consensus, if you like, about what was causing those. There was a number of theories, but uncertainty about what was causing those.
Okay. And if I could just, I don't know which, I've forgotten the exhibit, Ms. Baker. It was tab 3 of the binder, which is the 2008
Exhibit
document.
398.
On small Roman 7, Mr. Lund, of that document, I just wanted to ask Cass, there are two paragraphs there at the top, just under the names. You can see them. It talks about FRSSI being a 6-year process, etc. But the second paragraph, I wonder if you could just explain to me what that second paragraph means.
So, Mr. Commissioner, are you're trying to make the link between FRSSI and the wild salmon policy?
Yes.
Yes. Initially, prior to the wild salmon policy being adopted in 2005, FRSSI had a couple of years under its belt, if you like, but we did see that it did meet the standards, if you like, of the wild salmon policy, in that it was clearly dealing with strategy 1, if you like, of the wild salmon policy. It was adhering to the 5-step process, which I think is in Appendix 2 of the wild salmon process. Policy. It was designed to be open and transparent, consistent, and involve stakeholders and user groups, and as well as environmental groups that had an interest in the resource. So it melded well with the intent of the wild salmon policy, and it was ahead of other regions in the province, if you like, in the sense that it was developing harvest rules with benchmarks, and included designed to get preferences or solicit preferences from stakeholders. So it met the test at the time, I guess, of the direction of the wild salmon policy.
And it makes reference there about the pilot implementation. And then it goes on to say the new escapement strategy were fully implemented. So was it no longer considered a pilot in 2007?
It, I think, met the test of the pilot. There was an interest in pilots in other areas as well, Barkley Sound, for example, where there was a fairly mature consultation process, and as well as it was a smaller, contained place with multiple species, whereas the Fraser was focused on Fraser Sockeye. So I think it's still a pilot, still met the conditions of a pilot that has not been abandoned, but there are other pilots being thought of as well. So, but it wasn't dropped as a pilot from being a pilot because it didn't meet the test. It continued to meet the test, I believe.
Okay. And in tab 6, again, I'm not sure of the exhibit number. It's the 2010.
Exhibit 399.
Thank you. I think it's page 25 in my tab, in any event. It's under the Part 4 discussion. I apologize for reading to you, but it might just help me ask you this, Dr. Cass. It says the model presented in the working paper, as well as the planning process, it supports focus on long-term strategies and don't attempt to capture all of the operational complexities of an in-season management. And then on the next page, I'm sorry, I think it's just on that one page. What I was trying to gather from you is, because just in the last few questions you answered for Ms. Baker, you were talking about sort of a year-by-year analysis of how it's working. But is it a policy that is aimed for in-season use, or is it?
There are some shortcomings of this particular model for in-season application. It does not account for fish and fisheries that change over time and space. So it is an overall long-term strategic approach, but it is and it has an annual. It runs on an annual cycle, but the performance measures are based on the sort of cumulative forward simulations that occur. But it does not. It's not a tool that, apart from overall setting escapement targets, is not a tool that allows you to differentiate between where harvest might occur, and certainly doesn't purport to make any recommendations about how the resource is allocated among stakeholders. So it is not an in-season model from that perspective. It's a pre-season model with that advocates a long-term plan that avoids or attempts to avoid a changing course and a lot of the rhetoric and finger pointing that goes on in season, with uncertainty about what the run size is and what management action should be taken. So it's an attempt to minimize the in-season issues that and by having a prescribed plan that applies across, that is agreed to and applies across a range of run sizes. It does not, as I said, deal with nuances of harvest rates from various fisheries or strategies that might change where fisheries occur.
So its use is primarily for pre-season forecasting?
Pre-season in the sense of it is agreed to, if you like, the strategy is agreed to for developing the plan pre-season. So it's the tool to guide the development of the plan pre-season. But I wouldn't want to say that it is not useful in season, because it is the tool by which you say, okay, here's a particular run size at some date in season. What's the corresponding harvest rate for that particular run timing group in season to achieve the escapement goal? So it does have a purpose in season, but it's not the tool that's used in season to manage all the complexities about changing run sizes and changing run timing, and it doesn't have that capability.
So is it
long-term planning?
Is it used for the integrated management plan?
Yes.
Mr. Commissioner, I wonder if it would be helpful if I just took you back to Exhibit 322 just to illustrate that link. So it's Exhibit 322, and if you could turn to page 15 again.
Which tab is that?
It's not a tab, it's an exhibit. It's on the screen. It's was brought. We marked this exhibit when Mr. Grout was in the stand. And so this, as we've been talking about, the FRSSI model develops these different options, correct? Which show these different curves that you see under the escapement strategies, correct?
Yes,
Mr.
that's
Cass?
correct.
And then once a decision is made to choose one of these options, say option 3 was chosen, then that curve so that decision making is pre-season, right? So you use the FRSSI model to create the options, and then the stakeholders and the department review the options, and a choice is ultimately made as to which of these options will govern a run timing group in season, right?
That is correct.
And then that option finds its way into the IFMP as a harvest rule, correct?
That's correct.
And then that harvest rule, which has been described through one of these options, then governs as the fish come in. When you actually see the fish coming in and you actually see the run size materializing, this rule tells you when you're allowed to start harvesting that run size and at what rate, at what point in time. Is that right?
The tool, once there's a run size pegged in season, then and it's assumed that that is represents the actual run size, then this tool is the tool that is used to guide what the harvest rate is, given the uncertainty in the en route mortality as well as what the escapement target is.
Right. So it says before the run starts pre-season, we say we choose option 3. That tells us that when the run size gets beyond 110,000 or whatever option 3 shows here, then we can start harvesting that run size, and the percentage that you can harvest is shown on that curve up to a maximum of 60%.
That's correct.
And that's how it works between pre-season and in-season. So you're not rerunning this model in season, but you're using the decision that was made pre-season to create the harvest rule that's then governs in season.
That is how it's designed. That's correct.
We will now recess for 15 minutes.